from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and from Oracle, and we started looking at our collection of Henry D. Thoreau stuff, objects that he owned and things that were also owned by his family and associated with him. A big part of that was this wonderful catalog titled An Observant Eye, the Thoreau Collection at the Concord Museum. Of course, all of you have come today to see David Wood and to hear him talk about his new book. David researches and writes on colonial and federal-era Concord craftsmen, including cabinet makers, silversmiths, and cloth makers. He's the editor and a contributor of the Concord Museum, Decorative Arts from a New England Collection, and he's been here at the museum for over 20 years now. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you and also to introduce David Wood. And I'm sorry.
Thank you, and let me add my welcome to the Concord Museum and my thanks to Devin and to Paula Antonovich for putting this together, and my particular thanks to Devin for helping me negotiate the gaudy mysteries of PowerPoint. We'll begin with a portrait of Henry Thoreau. This is Walton Ricketson's portrait of Thoreau, which is actually quite an accomplished piece when it's photographed well, which it very rarely is. But we had the benefit of working with photographer David Bohl on this catalog, and actually Ricketson, who was the son of Thoreau's great friend Daniel Ricketson from New Bedford, was a portraitist, a portrait sculptor, and he concentrated on people in Concord. And as I say, when you look at it right, his portrait, although it's posthumous, is really quite accomplished. I wanted to start, I think, with a paraphrase from Charles Dickens, who started his Christmas Carol with a paraphrase from Hamlet to the effect that if you didn't know Hamlet's father was dead, you wouldn't be surprised to see him walking on the parapet as his son was. And in that same vein, I would say that if you don't know Henry Thoreau as a transcendentalist, what it was that he accomplished, which I will go on to address briefly, and which I address in this book, what he goes on to accomplish specifically in the realm of material culture history, wouldn't really make sense. But as I say, he was a transcendentalist. As his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson said, transcendentalist means idealist. And as Emerson also said in his essay, Nature, idealist means basically you don't know anything more about the world other than what you know about it through ideas, which sounds like a very basic precept. It is quite basic. It goes back to the very foundations of philosophy, so for that reason it's a dangerous idea if for no other. And it really does help to keep that in mind in looking at the very broadly synthetic view of his world that Thoreau habitually took. He was always looking at the broadest possible view, and that, as I would suggest, that's the idealist view. We'll get there. Thoreau was, as you know, a resident of Concord, born in Concord, spent almost all of his days in Concord, and did a number of things. He was a pencil maker. He was quite good at it. His father was a pencil maker. Thoreau went some way toward improving the manufacture of pencils. And then he, as he himself said, once he got it down, why do it any longer? But he did actually continue to make pencils, you could say basically through his whole life. He was also a surveyor. This is his survey of Walden Pond, the one that appears in Walden, and he did it in 1846 when he was at the pond. But after that, in the 1850s, he was a professional surveyor and spent a lot of his time doing that. So he was a pencil maker, he was a surveyor, but he did those things not as ends in themselves, but he did those things so that he could afford to do what he really meant to do, to do what he really meant to do with his life, which was to be a writer. This is a leaf from his essay, Walking, and I would say all the objects are in this collection and are in the book. All the objects I'm showing, with the exception of the some marginal drawings from the journal, the objects that you see are in the collection, including this leaf. A wonderful essay, and a great passage that's included on this leaf. But it was as a writer that Thoreau intended to live his life, and so those other activities were meant to support the writing, and that's something that he goes on a great deal about in Walden. Don't live for your job. The farmer becomes comes to work for his farm. He's saying, don't do that. Pursue your real aims and get a living by whatever means you can. And that's more or less what he set out to do. Now, in a very early passage in his journal, Thoreau talks about writing. I'm inclined to think, sums up his whole aim for his writing in a poem, well, not a poem, a prospectus for a poem that he wrote in his journal. The majority, I think that's safe to say, majority of Thoreau's writing is in his journal, about 7,000 pages, 2 million words that he wrote from 1837 until 1861, is it? I mean, the last entry, I think, is November of 1861. He wrote in his journal, and I used the journal as a resource for this book, and I will say a little bit more about that in a moment. But let me quote you that prospectus for a poem. He wrote, "I think I could write a poem to be called Concord. For argument I should have the river, the woods, the ponds, the hills, the fields, the swamps and meadows, the streets and buildings, and the villagers." Now, it's interesting, I think, that he's not just talking about what he's always associated with, which is nature and the hills and streams and all that. He includes the village as part of this poem, and the village and villagers. This is Barber's view of Concord in 1839, a nice image of the center of town. So for Thoreau, this poem, and poem is the way that Thoreau uses it, the poem and poet, these are the highest products of art. The poet is the greatest artist, the poem is the greatest product of art, and that doesn't mean that people who rhyme words are the greatest things, but that you need a word for the highest artistic aspiration. As far as Thoreau is concerned, a good word is poet, and that's what he styled himself. So poem ought not to be taken too literally in this case. But he is specifically grouping together natural history and social history in that one little passage. As far as he's concerned, it's the same thing. And the thesis of the essay in this book is that he pursued that much further, and that he pursued it over an extended period, and that what he was aiming to do was to develop a language where he could make it clear to his readers, he always had his readers in mind, that make clear to his readers what he meant by associating these things together. He wanted a more natural social history than was available to him, and there are a number of places where he says that quite specifically. So what happens right off the bat that you can see in this pursuit of Thoreau's, what happens right off the bat is that he starts documenting, discovering, recording people who are otherwise lost to history. And if you've looked in the journal, it's one of the things that becomes quite apparent. Or just, elsewhere, Thoreau generally given a reputation for, you know, hanging around with the wrong sort. You know, he's always out with people beneath polite regard, I guess you would say. And that is the case. And it was not because he wasn't trying to teach anybody a lesson or anything like that. He felt that he had lessons to learn from people like this. And it has to do with, this is Sal Cummings that we're looking at here, that Thoreau called the masculine, wild-eyed woman of the fields. And the things that he records in his journal about her lifestyle makes it clear that she was on the margin. She was not a mainstream person. And if you look in the rest of the town records, you're not going to find Sal Cummings. That's kind of interesting. We only know about her because Thoreau saw her. And his contemporaries, Thoreau's contemporaries on the streets in Concord, didn't see her at all. Thoreau says something very like that in his first book, in Week on the Concord and Merrimack. He's on the river, he's talking about being on the river. He starts talking about an account book. You'll have to remember account book, because when I get to that in just a moment, start talking about this idea of Thoreau as cultural historian, account books figure into that. It's an unusual thing to do in 1848, say, to read an account book in order to find out what it has to say about history. People didn't do that. We're used to doing that now. You didn't do it in 1848, but Thoreau did. And what he noticed in the account book is that it told him real, true things about fishermen. He was on the Merrimack River, and so here he found this account book, and he was reading an account book from 1805. He's reading about fishermen. And he goes, well, here's fishermen in this account book. And I see fishermen on the river all the time. But when I look in history, I can't find fishermen. And when I ask my neighbors about fishermen, they don't know what I'm talking about. They were absolutely invisible. They were invisible to their contemporaries. They're invisible to history, but they weren't invisible to Thoreau. And that is a very modern sort of thing. I mean, it's half the work of a social historian to reconstruct lives that are otherwise invisible. It seems a commonplace, but even the discipline itself wasn't even defined in print until 1939. And here, just about a century before, Henry Thoreau is practicing he's got the same notion, and he found a way to practice it. And the way, that's the segue into what that way was that he was practicing. This is the title of the essay in the book, Common Sense Applied to the Objects. And what Thoreau meant by, that's actually a quote from Thoreau. He meant by that that when someone who knows how a thing is made and knows how a thing is used looks at it, they simply apply common sense to it, and then they can read it as a historical artifact. And what Thoreau cited in this passage, what he was citing, was a crew that had gone out to look for traces of Franklin's expedition, Franklin's doomed expedition to find the Northwest Passage. And there was an article written up on the results of this second expedition that had gone to find traces of Franklin. And they were writing about things like saw marks on beef bones, and they were interpreting them, and it was telling them things about what they were finding. In fact, they found traces of Franklin's expedition, and the means they used to do it was something that was familiar to Thoreau, and this is the term he applied to it, common sense applied to the objects. It's something Thoreau did himself all the time, to a great deal because to a great extent, because he himself made things and knew how things were made and watched people making things, paid attention to them in that way. And there are a number of examples of that, as I say in the essay, but the one I wanted to mention today was a part of connoisseurship, which is just knowing what you're looking at. And Thoreau was had very considerable connoisseurship skills. But he also just plain appreciated stuff. which for a museum curator is always nice to see, is somebody appreciating stuff. And Thoreau really did. About this looking glass, he said, which belonged to his friends, Mary and George Minot, who lived right across the street, right there. Miss Minot has several old pieces of furniture that belonged to her grandfather Prescott. One, a desk made for him in March 1760. She said the looking glass was held to be the oldest furniture she thought. It has the name John scratched on the middle by a madcap named John Bulkley from college, who had got so far with a diamond before he was stopped. John Bulkley from college means that he was rusticated to Concord while he was at Harvard. Obviously his grades weren't up, so he was sent out to Concord to study with the minister. This is why his grades weren't up, because he was a defiler of looking glasses, I guess. Thoreau wrote another passage about old furniture that is really unsurpassed in the literature on furniture. That, again, gives a good idea of how much he appreciated what he was looking at. I just want to read that passage too. How much more agreeable to sit in the midst of old furniture like Minot's clock and secretary and looking glass, which have come down from other generations, than in that which was just brought from the cabinet makers and smells of varnish like a coffin. To sit under the face of an old clock that's been ticking 150 years, there's something mortal, not to say immortal, about it. A clock that began to tick when Massachusetts was a province. So this is the kind of thing that objects could do for Thoreau. They could bridge that gap like a secant. They can cut right across a curve, take you right back to a past period, and then Thoreau adds to the value added that Thoreau brings to this is that he looked around at other kinds of evidence as well, and it did the same thing for him. Took him right back there, taught him things about the past that he could not find in books. And again, this is I'm suggesting because he was trying to put together natural history and social history into one thing. In other words, as far as Thoreau was concerned, social history is a subset of natural history. And he was setting about to demonstrate that. One of the other old things that Thoreau always paid attention to was old houses. There are many passages. I don't think you walk past a 17th century house without looking at it, which is also kind of an unusual thing to do in the 1840s and 50s. And one of his favorites was the Hunt House here in Concord, which is no longer extant, but here it is in a painted view. Let me point out right away that an element that I'm going to talk about in a second is absent from this view. There was actually an overhang here, so that the second story stepped forward a little bit, overhung the lower story. I'm still not quite sure why it's missing from this portrait, except to suggest that this painting of the house was done after the house was taken down. So perhaps the painter didn't know about that overhang. Well, Thoreau knew about that overhang. And in fact, he cited a couple of other examples of that overhang. Not only did he look at 17th century houses himself, but he looked at other people's accounts of 17th century houses, and he knew, for instance, about the 17th century house that had recently been taken down in Deerfield, what's called the Old Indian House, or the 1704 house, a relic of the 1704 raid on Deerfield. The house was demolished, and there was a there was a magazine article about it which Thoreau read, which cited that overhang, and Thoreau said, "That sounds familiar. I know where there's one of those things." So you see where the little star is this little building, which Thoreau cites in his journal because he looked at this painting. This is a painting after Doolittle's view of the center of Concord. Doolittle's view was an engraving that was done in 1775 as part of the Revolutionary War effort. This is a painting that was done about 50 years later and that belonged in the Buttrick family when Thoreau knew it in the 1850s. And he saw it in their house and studied it and noticed this overhang. So here's the overhang that we didn't see in that view. And this is a way to build an urban type of house. It's a way to have a roadway, but then the second story can be a little bigger, and you know, so the carts can go by, but you can fill up every available inch, and that's what gave London its particular look and its particular ability to burn when when the time came. They would basically fill every available space with these houses. This is one way to do it, do this overhang. It isn't something that was practiced in Massachusetts Bay after about 1710 or so. So Thoreau was right on the money, noticing that here is an archaic construction technique no longer found in the landscape, and he had an example of it, and he studied it as closely as he could. Including drawing plans for it in his journal. So what happened was his friend Edmund Hosmer bought that house and was determined to take the old house down. There were two houses on the property. Was determined to take the old house down. Thoreau and his friend Daniel Ricketson, Thoreau's friend Daniel Ricketson talked for a while about buying the house and making it a clubhouse, and so it would be sort of he called it philosopher. Daniel Ricketson did. You know, it would be the Philosophers Club in Concord, so they could, when he came up, Channing and Thoreau and Emerson and Ricketson could go there and think great thoughts. Didn't work out. He also Ricketson talked about removing a chamber from the house, removing the paneling of a chamber from the house and moving it down to New Bedford, which would have been a very unusual thing to do in 1857, 1858. People didn't get onto that trick until rather later. And if you're familiar with the Concord Museum, you can see that's exactly what Russell Cattell did here in 1929 and 1930, was remove paneling from houses that were unused, demolished, or whatever it was. But there again, they were a little prescient in thinking of doing a thing like that, but that too didn't happen. The house was torn down. Thoreau watched with real attention, and he noticed things like what he did was used his understanding of materials and construction techniques to separate this house into component parts. It's not clear from the outside, and I'll show you, remind you that view of the outside in just a moment. It's not clear from the outside what's going on inside. Thoreau took it upon himself to puzzle this thing out, and if you've ever tried this yourself, it's a maddening exercise. With a 17th century house that's been moved around and rotated and rebuilt and moved across the street and then back, and you know, they're all over the place. But he was figuring this thing out, and you see here he says old. This part's old. This part's old. And he says oak frame. He'd noticed that the oak frame parts are the oldest parts, and the pine frame parts were newer parts. And so there's new parts and there's old parts. And I'll just remind you of what the house looked like. It looks like a sort of federal house with, you've got 5 windows above, 4 windows below, symmetrically arranged door right there in the middle. And Thoreau says, wait a minute, what's that door doing there? It doesn't belong there. And while he was actually away from the house and just thinking about it, he figured out where the door was, where the old door was. Here it is. Here's the old door. So here's the old house, and there's the central location of the old door. Here's the now central location of the house with this addition on it. And here you can see that overhang indicated in Thoreau's drawing, that one that's absent from the painting. He figured out a lot more things about this house. It goes on forever in the book. It's amazingly tedious. Now, actually, it's really cool that he could just see all that stuff with no training available to him, really, except what he knew about making things. So he went through that exercise, and then in a very nice passage, he summed this whole thing up, summed up this whole exercise of looking at an old house. Consider how I discovered where the Winthrop family in this town placed their front door some 200 years ago, without any verbal or written or ocular evidence. So he's using the evidence of the house itself, and now he's using his memory of the evidence that he saw to puzzle out this house. I first suspected and then verified it. I, with others, saw by the frame of the old Hunt house that an addition had been made to the west end in 1703. That's the date that's on the chimney. He also figured out by the way the bricks overlaid the framing of the house what parts the chimney was contemporary with, what parts it was earlier than, and so on. And that's how he determined that this change was made in 1703. This brought the front door, which was in the middle of the present, near one end of the original or Winthrop house. I, sitting at home and to myself, having an occult sympathy with the Winthrops of that date, said to himself, the front door must originally have been in the middle of the old house, for symmetry and convenience required it, and if it was, I shall find traces of it. I shall find from where studs had been set into the frame in a different manner from the rest. I went to the house and looked where the door should have been, and I found precisely the evidence I sought. I'm not sure what that passage was written for, but it was, I mean, it does sound like something he intended to use in a publication, because he's that sort of chatty tone, and also his deliberate use of occult. Occult, he doesn't mean weird and spooky. Occult means invisible. That's all it means. So he's got an invisible relationship to this house that tells him things about it. And that invisible relationship I'm suggesting here is his connoisseurship, that he can go to an old thing where there's nothing written about it and there's no one to tell him about it, and just by looking at the thing itself, learn about it. And again, it sounds so commonplace, it sounds like such an obvious thing to do, but there are few precedents for it in the period that Thoreau was working. There is one in art history, a writer with whom Thoreau cannot have been familiar because he didn't begin to publish until after 1867. That's the art historian Morelli, and you know, so this sort of thing was in the air, I guess you could say. But Thoreau, very much a participant of it, working in isolation, basically, in Concord at that date. And as I say, it may just be the fact that he's using the same tools that we tend to use here at the Concord Museum day to day that makes this so compelling. But it did add a great deal of interest to this project. And I would say, just parenthetically, what I probably should have begun with, just an acknowledgement of what a real privilege it was to work with this material. There are 250 objects here that can be associated with Thoreau or his family, about half of them in this book, and that's most of the stuff that can reliably be associated with Thoreau and the Thoreau family. So it is an amazing resource to have to deal with, and that, coupled with the extraordinary resource of Thoreau's journal, as I say, makes for a very entertaining project. I just wanted to end up briefly with this object as an illustration of the sort of thing, you know, as I said, about 125 objects in here. Many of them have references in the journal where Thoreau talked about the thing itself, or he talked about things like it, or something like that. But they're all kind of loaded and connected in one way or another. This one, obviously, particularly so because it's one of the few lifetime images of Thoreau that survive. But this also gives a sort of picture of the path by which these things were saved. And that path runs through Sophia Thoreau, Henry's sister, in that half of the things that are in this collection came by way of Sophia, one way or another, either directly or because she had given it to someone else and then it came back through here. So she took charge of the material legacy of Henry Thoreau at the same moment that she took charge of his literary legacy. She shepherded his writings through their first generations of publication, and then turned that task over to others. But it was by Sophia's agency that most of these things survived, including this piece. And the other name that comes up with this one is the one I'd mentioned before, Daniel Ricketson, because it was Ricketson who had his friend Thoreau sit for this when he was visiting in New Bedford. So after Thoreau died, Ricketson sent this ambrotype. Ambrotype is a kind of photograph. Sent this ambrotype to Sophia in Concord and said, "I have concluded to send the ambrotype of Henry by mail. When I heard of your brother's death, I went to the artist who took the picture and got the duplicate of the one I had for you. I sent you the strongest impression, the first taken. The one I keep," that's this one here, "is a little lighter in color, which led me to choose it, but I now see the stronger expression in yours. If you were here, I should like you to have your choice. We all consider it very lifelike and one of the most successful likenesses we ever saw." So he, after Thoreau's death, he sent this. He ended up sending the other impression of this to Sophia, and then this stayed in his family and came to the collection through Walton Ricketson, the sculptor, that bust we saw in the very beginning. Sophia was delighted with that. "Most heartily do I thank you for the picture of my dear brother which was received on Saturday. It was very kind of you to secure the duplicate for me. Until a few weeks since, I did not know that Henry had his picture taken when in New Bedford last." None of the daguerreotypes have pleased us, and I did not imagine that the ambrotype would afford as much satisfaction. Still, I felt curious to see it, thinking I might get a copy of yours in case we liked it. I need not tell you, for I cannot, how agreeably surprised I was on opening the little box to find my own lost brother again. I could not restrain my tears. The picture is invaluable to us. I discover a slight shade about the eyes expressive of weariness, but a stranger would not observe it. I'm very glad to possess a picture of so late a date. Mr. Channing, Emerson, Alcott, and many other friends who've looked at the ambrotype express much satisfaction. So that gesture on Ricketson's part was very well received by Sophia, and as I said, by these various paths, these things have come together in this collection, and as I say, have been now assembled in the catalog. So I think that concludes what I had to say this afternoon. And the online accessibility to this collection is the third part of that project, and that is underway. Most of these things are on view in the museum at present, in the Thoreau Gallery. Yeah, it's appalling when you think of how many words Thoreau wrote out. He transcribed everything, you know. There's 2 million words in the journal, but you probably have to multiply that by 2 or so. Yeah, that was something that Thoreau got in Maine, didn't really write about in his journal, about acquiring them, but I think he had them shipped back to him in Concord, and then that winter he used them. I think just because he was curious about them. He also may have hoped that they would help him walk around in the woods in the winter. That didn't seem to work out. He said they threw the snow up on his back, and the next winter he doesn't mention using them. And there are quotes in there about that in the entry on the snowshoes. But I think the larger point from that, and the one that still has contemporary relevance, is that he noted that you find it, at all the auctions of estates in and around Concord, he said you always find a pair of these snowshoes in the garret. And somebody buys them and sticks them in their own garret, and then they're there for the next time. But he said nobody uses them anymore. He talked to the older people that he knew, and they said, oh yeah, we used to use them, we don't use them anymore. The reason was it didn't snow as much as it did in the past. Thoreau was just at the end of what's called the Little Ice Age, the one that began in the 16th century and is so well documented in Dutch and North German paintings. And it was tapering off at the time that Thoreau was there, and it really was true that winters were rougher in the old days. That the old folks weren't lying when they said that it was snowier in the old days. And of course, it's much less so now when you read about Thoreau skating up Concord River all the way to Sudbury and then all the way to Chelmsford, and you can't do that anymore. So that process that he documented, and which actually came to his attention. I mean, he knew what was going on. It's still ongoing. Let's see. I guess because the museum was publisher, we were closer to the process than if you just handed it over. So I could go on and on about the process itself, but it was interesting to see. It strikes me as being almost a handmade book in a way. I went down to the printer while this thing was on the press, and the presses are basically, they run from here to there, and from that chair to that wall, so that's a press. But there are people crawling all over it and fitting the grippers of the plates into the rollers and things like that. So that, here's this wonderful machine, but it doesn't work until the pressmen, and they call themselves pressmen, till the pressmen get in there and do what they can do, and then they can make that thing work. So I was very interested to see that shop tradition surviving in book printing. I have no, it's a small edition, so I have no idea what it's like when you're printing, enormous things. It's probably less interesting, but these people were craftsmen. It's great fun.